I'm Henry Jenkins. I'm the Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, and Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California. As I prefer, Professor of Miscellaneous Studies would cover the whole territory fairly well. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event as part of the Trojan's Parents Weekend on behalf of the Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism, which is delighted to have a chance to share with you some thoughts about the current moment of digital media and parenting. And I should begin my remarks by first of all saying congratulations. You've resisted, no doubt, infinite temptations to snap your son or daughter's head off at various points along the way, and you've protected them from the seemingly also infinite number of forms of self-destruction that most adolescents have been subject to. And you've gotten them here safely to college age, which I think is a major accomplishment. And I think you wouldn't be here if, with a son and daughter at USC, if you had not, in fact, done a spectacular job. That, you know, I'm not here to tell you you've done a bad job. Far from it. I think most parents are grappling with a moment of profound media change with enormous competence, with, you know, common sense, with goodwill and openness. And I think that's what is needed to deal with some of the challenges and opportunities that digital media has represented in the lives of American young people and young people around the world. So this slide sort of captures, though, the messages we get all the time from media. If I talk about educating the digital generation, this slide says, "Johnny, did you learn anything today?" And there's Grand Theft Auto on the table in front of him, and he says, with a glare, "You betcha." And it's sort of the idea of learning through digital media or learning through games comes with the sense of, you know, moral debauchery, I think, in the ways in which we talk about it. And I want to sort of challenge that framing of what's going on here in some of the remarks I'm going to give today. About 4 years ago, I was asked by the MacArthur Foundation to write or lead the writing of this white paper called Confronting the Challenges of Participatory Culture, Media Education in the 21st Century. And it was an attempt to just map the framework. What kinds of learning are going on for young people outside of the classroom? How are they making sense of the digital media in their lives? And what lessons can we take as parents, as educators, as leaders of institutions that affect young people's lives? How do we make them work, help them work better to close the gap that often exists between the kinds of learning that takes place outside of school and the kinds of learning that takes place inside of school? The New Media Literacies course that I teach here in Annenberg, I ask my students to interview a teenager. And because the students come from all over the world, they end up producing profiles of teens from all over the planet, from Bulgaria to Lapland, from Japan to Iran. And what we get in almost every case is the kids they interview feel like their richest experiences as learners take place outside of school. And that for many of them, they're forced to shed ways of learning, tools, and strategies that work effectively for them outside the classroom when they arrive at the schoolhouse gates. If we repeat the science project of teachers, we hear teachers explain how frustrated they are by policies that often are set to not allow them to utilize the full resources of digital media through the schools. And so there's a mismatch. And part of the work that MacArthur's Digital Media and Learning Initiative has done has been to try to understand that mismatch a little better and to try to think about the learning that's taking place. And it sort of stands in the face of a series of stories you're seeing in the news about sexting, about using mobile phones at school to cheat, about violent video games, about the risk of multitasking, about YouTube and the loss of kids as newsreaders, about the threats of school shootings, about the exposure of kids to pornography, about the dangers of plagiarism in Wikipedia, about cyberbullying in various forms. The message you get over and over is parents and grandparents, your children could be in danger. And I'm not going to make any of those risks go away. They're very real risks. They're very real challenges. But I also think we don't serve kids well if we lock those conversations out of the school and we lock out the tools that around them outside of the school. That we have to actually pay attention to other stories that are going on, stories that emphasize the benefits of new media technology as well as the risk. So let's take about a story for a moment. This is Peter. And Peter lives in lives in New York. Peter is someone who considers himself, as he would call it, a master of the webs. He's someone who enjoys playing with avatars and alternative identities, which is not that uncommon among adolescents. It's a period of identity play, of trying on roles and masks and costumes and seeing who you are. He's someone who belongs to an extended social network of other friends for whom he talks about the issues of his life. He's someone who takes photographs, and he started out just taking photographs and putting them on Flickr, and then he's ended up getting his pictures picked up by the local newspaper, and he's picking up a little small change as a sort of freelance photographer working for the local newspaper. And he's deeply concerned with the issues in his communities. He's very socially aware. He's very social active. He wants to work on his own and with his friends to make a difference in the world. He's a volunteer. And we know that Peter's generation is a generation of volunteers. He lives with his aunt and uncle, and his uncle sort of says to him that his generation has more power than ever before, and his uncle's philosophy is, with great power comes great responsibility. Now, by now, you may have pieced together that the Peter I'm talking about is Peter Parker, also known as Spiderman. And I tell this story in part to make the point that in our imaginations, we already have a much more empowered image of young people and their capacity to make a difference in the world, to mobilize knowledge, to join forces with other people, to try to change their communities. The story of Peter Parker gives us a different mythology for thinking about what we're observing over and over as we look at young Americans and young people around the world about their relationship to technology. And it's very interesting. If you look at a contemporary Spider-Man comic, and I don't know how many of you looked at the comics recently, there was a moment when the superhero had to be embedded in a major news organization to understand what's going on in his community. Right? So Superman works as a newspaperman. Peter Parker is a news photographer. It was all about flows of information. Who has access to the information they need in order to go out and understand what's taking place in the community? And you either had to, like Batman, be connected to the police, or like Superman and Spider-Man, collected to the news media in order to have that information. Well, Peter Parker recently got laid off. Right? He doesn't work necessarily for the newspaper anymore, and it doesn't matter because he's got access to his computer, his mobile phone. He's surrounded by an information environment which allows him to monitor and respond quickly to the issues of his community. Another thing we might learn from talking about Peter Parker is that Peter Parker participates in a community that involves young people as well as adults. Right? No one's looking down at Peter Parker for his age. He's capable of doing what he's capable of doing. He's capable of contributing to that community what his abilities allow him, time and abilities allow him to do. And it's a good thing because Thor is like 500 years old. So if we counted age in the world of superheroes, all of us would be immature from the perspective of Thor. So I think it's important to have an image as we think about these online communities that include the capacity to contribute at whatever age and whatever abilities that you're at. And here's Aunt May, and at least in a contemporary Spider-Man comic, and Aunt May struggles to raise a kid who stays out too late, who keeps secrets from her, who doesn't always tell her what he's up to, and she does her best to imprint him with her values, to protect him, to ensure he grows into a responsible adult. And it's not easy to be Aunt May in the Spider-Man comics. It's a pretty thankless role to try to take care of the budding young superhero that she's raising, and doesn't always know necessarily that he is a superhero. It depends on which version of the book. Now, as I said, I'm one of you. My son's now 29, so he's a little older than some of the kids represented by parents in this room, but I've gone through this process, and I know just how challenging it can be. And I know that many of my friends who are parents are torn between two poles. That is, one pole is laissez-faire. I don't understand this stuff. My kids will figure it out on their own, and they're going to be okay. And that's not too far off, but maybe it's not the best strategy. The other side is I'm going to snoop around. I'm going to look at everything that he does online. I'm going to spy on my kid if I need to make sure that he's safe. So I want to suggest that between those two, maybe a space where we are involved in dialogue, where we're aware of our kids' activities, and we're not snooping over their shoulders, but we're watching their backs. right? And that role seems like a very important one for us to think about. We're not locked in panic. We're not casual. We are aware that he's entering, our son or daughter is entering into a space that's different from the world we grew up in, and we look for ways that we can open conversations about it and figure this stuff out together. Because kids are no more competent than adults to figure this thing out just because they've grown up with it. It's changing every day, and there's new puzzles and new things that we have to put our heads together around. So this picture is up here because it sort of reminds me of my earliest experiences with my kid in media. When he was about 4 or 5, we sort of said, instead of reading you a bedtime story every night, we're going to alternate nights. So one night we'll read you a bedtime story, the next night you write a story. And we sat there on the computer and we typed in the story he composed, and we talked about the story. He took the story and he illustrated it with pictures. And every year, at various family holidays, we printed them out and sent them to grandparents as a book of his stories and pictures. And that's something that's very easy to do in the digital age. Right? And what it did was meant that every night we had a place for a conversation. That the stories are often stories at his age on He-Man and WWE wrestling and Pee Wee Herman. Those were the folk figures of his childhood. But those figures figured prominently in his stories. And it meant that I knew what media he was consuming. We could express our own values. We could do so in a playful, creative way. We endowed in him the ability to think of himself as an author of his culture rather than a victim of his culture. And that process continued in one way or another through his growing up. We always found that mechanism through which you could engage with a kid around media and be able to involve in a conversation. As I said, one of the challenges is not every kid had that experience, right? And kids are growing up in a culture where this digital technology is all around them. They're acquiring skills through that. We might think of that process as the new hidden curriculum. The 1960s, educators told us that kids who grew up in homes with opera records and encyclopedias and dinner table conversations and trips to museums and symphonies and operas and plays, they did better in school and were perceived as doing better in school because they spoke the language of school than those kids who didn't have those experiences. And those kids being raised today in a household where the digital is part of the overall process, but also part of the interactions of the entire family, seem to have the same ability to do better in school, to become part of the culture, be ready for school. But many kids are being left out. And so they come to school, and increasingly our schools are terrified of this stuff because they've seen all those news stories that I flashed up earlier, and they're anxious about kids' relationship to technology. Better safe than sorry. Now, so let's think about it. On one hand, if I'm concerned about these risks, is your kid better off being taught about the ethical challenges, the safety risk and concern of digital media by a trained teacher or librarian at school, or being told to deal with it on their own? So if your concern is safety, it seems to me schools ought to be dealing with this stuff. If you believe, as I do, that it also has potentials for educational value, for the future careers, their future experience as expressed citizens and expressive individuals, then we also want to make sure it's in school and that we really build on those skills and foster them through the classroom to make sure they're available to every kid, not just those kids who've been raised in families where the digital has been part of their lives. And that goes to, we're not just facing a digital divide, we're facing what I call a participation gap. The digital divide is about access to technology. Participation gap is about access to skills, knowledge, experiences, which allow you to use that technology meaningful. So we've made a lot of ground over the last 20 years on the digital divide. We're not there yet, but we've made a lot of ground. Participation gap, we're just beginning to really factor in and think about. Now, underlying my notion of the participation gap is my notion of participatory culture. Right? And what I mean by participatory culture is the kinds of culture that kids are engaging with as gamers, as fans, as contributors to Wikipedia, as participants in online communities. That what we see when we look closely at those cultures, good and bad, what we're seeing is a lot of learning's taking place. Right? And the learning that's taking place is one where there's relatively low barriers for engagement. It's easy to get involved. It's easy to participate in those spaces. Where there's strong support for sharing what you create with others through platforms like YouTube, Second Life, Flickr. These are platforms that make it easy to share cultural creations. There's a system of informal mentorship of more experienced people teaching new people. And I put it that way because it's not age specific, right? The most experienced person could be 15-year-old, the new person could be 35, but they can learn from each other because some of the social barriers are taken down. The members believe their contributions matter. They care about each other's opinions of self and work. And it says here, not every member must contribute, but all must believe they're free to contribute when ready, and that what they contribute will be appropriately valued. Now, I should note, this is an example of participatory culture, because I put in the Google image search participatory culture and discovered someone had made this slide explaining my ideas. And I thought it was a better slide than I was going to make, so I took it and incorporated it into the presentation, right? And this is how it works, right? In a world of participatory culture where we share our creations with each other in an open way, I throw out my ideas in the world, other people react to them, they process them, they remake them, they remix them. It comes back to me better than it was before, and I'm able to then share it in an effective way to another community, and the process begins all over again. And that's the essence of what I'm calling a participatory culture. And it's something that I think young people who are active online have begun to understand and live through. Now, this is another chart that was created by another part of the Digital Media and Learning Initiative that MacArthur put together, which was headed by Mimi Ito, who was formerly at USC and now is at UC Irvine. And her team did a large-scale ethnography, 20 ethnographers in the field looking at teenagers, what they're doing with media. And she says there are 3 genres of participation, or 3 ways young people are learning in their relationship to media. And the first, she says, is hanging around. And this is something teens have always done. More and more teens are hanging around through MySpace and Facebook and social network sites, but they're basically driven by friendship ties, by social networks, the desire to just connect with other kids. And in a world where kids are living further apart, where they're not always able to get together face to face, this hanging around becomes a site where they're learning new technology in order to hang out with their friends who they might not be able to see outside of school and might not have sufficient time to talk to through school. Second, messing about is this literally, you sit down at the computer. I don't know about you, but my son never read an instruction manual in his life. He just plunges in, tries stuff, messes around with it, and that process of tinkering and experimentation leads to kinds of knowledge about how the technology works. And then geeking out, my favorite of the categories, geeking out happens when you find something you're really passionate about, where you're seeking information, where you're desiring to connect with other people who share those interests. And as you do that, then you dig deeper into the pools of information and the knowledge communities that are out there. Now, in an ideal sense, so what we did in the MacArthur white paper was identify 12 skills and social competencies that we think are emerging from these various kinds of participation online. These are things kids are learning how to do, and these are things that we think are valuable to do that have come out of it. So to give you let me play this video that will walk us through those skills a little more. In a sec.
The new media literacies are a set of skills that everybody needs to deal with our culture today.
To function in the current media environment.
With the internet, with cell phones.
How to interact with information and with culture.
With just the pace of life, which is very different now than it was 20 years ago.
They're the things they need to know to become creative artists, to become citizens.
Well, you're not going to see the pictures, but hopefully we can listen.
In the past, media literacy was all about trying to get consumers of media to think critically about what they were watching.
Large numbers of people were receiving media messages that were created by a small number of producers.
Now we start to look at the child as both a consumer and a producer of media, and we look at the ramifications that has in their lives.
We're not really just consumers anymore. We're also making things. We're putting stuff out there, whether it's just a Facebook profile or something more complex.
Narratives where the reader plays a role in shaping the story.
A video or an art piece.
Interactive online spaces.
Anything that I might put on the internet So rather than just asking questions of creators, we're now also having to ask questions about ourselves.
What do we need to participate? What skills do we need now?
One example of skill might be judgment, where you find some information online and you need to be able to decide whether that information is reliable or not.
Negotiation means knowing how to enter into different groups and different spaces and knowing how to understand what the different norms are.
Appropriation, how do I remix and sample content in a meaningful way?
One of my favorite skills is play, which we define as the capacity to experiment with your surroundings as a form of problem solving.
Transmedia navigation.
Simulation.
Collective intelligence.
Performance.
Distributed cognition.
And visualization.
Multitasking.
They're not just skills for the classroom, and they're not just skills for the workplace. They're skills that involve creative expression. They're skills that involve citizenship. They're skills that connect people together at something larger than the individual levels.
Learning new skills, new competencies to make really great things and be full participants.
So that was a video we made with my team when I was back at MIT. Several of those people are now part of the Annenberg family and are contributing actively to the continuation of that research while we're here. Now, one of the things that's important as we think about it is that in an ideal educational environment, kids are learning everywhere, and what they're learning is valued everywhere else. That is, we don't dismiss the skills that we're talking about when they move to school. That if they're learning outside of school, those skills become a meaningful part of education. And this is a chart we created to think about the mix of at-home play, after-school programs, community-based centers of one sort or another, including churches, synagogues, and other religious spaces, and schools, all of which are places that shape the intellectual growth, the moral, social growth of young people, and help them to acquire the skills they're going to need for adulthood. And so all of them also then have something to contribute to the fostering of these new media literacies that we're talking about, which will enable this generation to engage with new media and with each other in very productive ways. So this is a group we've been working with out of New York, the Global Kids, which is a group that uses everything, has been doing really effective stuff with Second Life, building virtual worlds, having kids build worlds together, focus on problems in their communities, focus on global issues, and acquiring the new media literacies out of school. We're also working now with teachers in New Hampshire for what's called an early adapter program to help them prepare and think about how they integrate this stuff into their teaching. And we're doing webinars once a month for educators that can listen from anywhere and learn some of the ideas that we've been developing through the work that we're doing on new media literacies. Now, one of the ways that people are talking about this phenomenon has been the distinction between digital natives and digital immigrants. And you've probably heard those phrases out there. I don't particularly personally like that language because I think it leads us down a bunch of bad paths. And starting with the kind of dicey political history that we have around notions of natives and immigrants, right? That, and I particularly don't like the assumptions that get made about immigrants or natives in this language. So one of the things is that it erases the differences between the experiences of young people, right? It sort of imagines a world where every person who was born in the last 2 decades grew up with a lot of digital technology in their home. And that may or may not be the case, right? That it may be the case for a lot of people in this room. It's certainly not the case for kids in other communities and other neighborhoods around the country. And to sort of assume that every kid has access to those digital skills erases that participation gap. But also to assume that those are the only skills that matter erases the validity of other ways of growing up and other ways of acquiring knowledge that we have to respect. So my image here has the cowboy, the Indian, and to sort of split the difference, Peter Pan. You know, there's lots of different ways of growing up, and they don't just necessarily fit in one framework or grid that we may have. It ignores the connection between young people and adults. And if we go back then to what I said about Thor, well, the reality is that what we're seeing when we look at participatory cultures, like fan communities, is they're places where adults and young people come together around shared interest. Their relationship is defined through the interest, not their age difference. But there's nevertheless a present of some of the fans I've interviewed talk of themselves as den mothers. who help look after younger fans, but also learn from them. And it's a different structure than school or church or even the family, but it's a different way that adults and young people relate to each other. And that, to my mind, is vital for many of the healthy communities we've looked at and tried to understand. Now, and I think it's dangerous for adults to throw up their hands and say, I'm a digital immigrant, I'll never understand this stuff. Because you want to be engaged. Just as you spent hours listening to bad off-key performances of John Philip Sousa's music, or badly played Little League games because it was interesting to your kids and you cared about it, you probably need to put in the same amount of time watching them play video games and surf the web. Because it's important to them, it's who they are, it's the world they live through, and I think it's vital to be engaged in that conversation. But, as I said, not to be a spy on that conversation, to be a participant. And that's what makes a difference in these cases. I also think the notion of digital natives and immigrants sort of dismisses the other technologies which are part of kids' lives. It's not that they live in a digital world. They live in a multimedia world of which digital technology is the new addition. But they're still watching a lot of television. They're still going to the movies. They're still listening to music. They're using mobile technologies. They're using books and print. Imagine that. And so there's a kind of conversation that's taking place across all of those media platforms. So they're not just adept at navigating the digital, they're adept at navigating across transmedia environments. The other side, the negative side of the immigrant phrase, is it implies immigrants are simply ignorant. And I think none of us in this room, if we were pushed to think about it, would imagine that's what we really mean by an immigrant. Because if we think about the picture we have here, we see that the immigrant brought with them lots of things from the mother country which were valuable. Traditions, knowledge, languages, ways of thinking. And so the adult population, when it calls itself digital immigrant and cuts itself off from the conversation, isn't owning up to the kinds of things that it knows that are valuable to young people still, even if the world that the young person's traveling through is one that's less familiar to us than the world we grew up in. And so I think I much more favor real dialogue, real conversation between people. And young people are facing then, as they move into this environment, complex set of ethical issues. I'm less interested in what media does to our kids and more interested in what kids do with media. And that means I'm more interested in ethics than effects. I'm more interested in the choices they're making and how they're making those choices than I am the idea of being victimized by media. But it still means we want to pay attention to core issues. One of those is ownership and authorship. So this is a really robust learning community, Fiction Alley, where fans of Harry Potter have written hundreds of thousands of stories about those characters and given each other feedback in a robust system called beta reading, where they read each other's work, respond to each other's work, help each other grow as writing. And many of the kids, they learned a lot more there than they learned in school. But underneath is the question, this is unauthorized appropriation of J.K. Rowling's stories. Rowling happens to like this. So they're pretty home free with Harry Potter fan fiction, but it's a struggle to think about how do they navigate the complexities of copyright, which is something in a very public way. You and I, growing up, probably made mixtapes and copied songs and gave them to each other. We were involved in copyright violation, but the odds of getting caught were a lot smaller than the odds of getting caught rewriting a story and putting it on the web. So I often hear that young people don't care about stealing content. And the reality we find when we interview young people is, in fact, they're undergoing pretty complex sets of ethical negotiations which factor in a variety of values and norms. It's not something that's easy or comfortable. It's simply that they've come up with a different balance of those norms than our generation necessarily imagined. Although, as I said, once we talk about mixtapes, we're probably in the same boat as they are. Right? And so here's what a kid said. I pirate a lot. I pirate everything. Why? Because I don't have money. And most of the time, more money than I could ever spend. I mean, I love him, Eric Clapton, but he has more money than God, and I don't think that he needs any more. But yet, if it's a self-recorded home-burned CD or an up-and-coming band, I will support them, and I'll buy the CD or movie if it's an up-and-coming filmmaker. The music industry and film industry are way too harsh. I think they should lighten up a little bit. I mean, I understand it's a copyright violation, but yet I think somehow that the movies get more exposure and games get more exposure through BitTorrent, even if they're downloaded illegally, than if they were to be paid for. Because someone probably want to pay $35 for a DVD, yet they'll see the movie and maybe buy it. And so they're weighing a whole bunch of variables there. So yeah, we found that if you ask a kid, is there a reason not to steal media, most of them don't come up with very good reasons not to steal it, although this one reflects some uncertainties about that. But if you ask, is there music you would always pay for, almost everyone has an answer. There's a kind of moral obligation or support for particular kinds of recording artists, for particular kinds of genres, that's reflected in the middle part of that statement there, that they're supporting certain artists, they don't trust the labels, but they trust the artist, and they're trying to navigate a complex terrain. The same issues crop up in every other area that we're thinking about. The same ethical balancing act goes on around, for example, issues of identity. You know, do you present your own identity on the online, or do you mask your identity? But is masking your identity the same thing as lying? Parents are always saying, make up stuff about yourself. Don't tell the truth. But that's giving kids pretty complex and mixed messages about when lying's okay and when it's not okay. And it's sort of, the negotiation of identity is a very real one. Negotiation of privacy. Kids are throwing all kinds of information out online, and they don't necessarily know, anticipate the paper trail that's going to leave. I mean, if you watch this presidential campaign, this current congressional campaign, candidates all over the country are being hit with videos of things they said 10 years ago. Right? Some of which happen to be said on television, but 20 years from now, it'll be what they said on Facebook and what they said on YouTube that's coming up. But that same process, I think that gotcha mentality we live in, our political life's going to be full of old Facebook pictures, you know, before much longer. And I think the same thing's true now when kids go get a job. If there are pictures of them tarting it up, smoking, drinking, playing like they're using drugs, whatever, that those pictures come back and haunt them at school admission processes, at job application processes. And so the challenge of thinking about those footprints is one that I think young people are struggling with. How do you process information? Wikipedia here is my illustration here. Many schools are saying just don't use Wikipedia. Yet Wikipedia has a lot of valuable information on topics that are not covered well by traditional encyclopedias. And our fantasy that Wikipedia contains inaccurate information and the encyclopedia is accurate overlooks the fact that at school they probably had 10 to 20-year-old encyclopedias in the school library, right? So which is more accurate, an up-to-date Wikipedia entry that may have distortions put in it, or a 20-year-old out-of-date encyclopedia that they're using off the shelf in the school library? It's an interesting question. When I talked to Jimmy Wales, the creator of Wikipedia, and said, is Wikipedia accurate? He says, that's the wrong question. It's when is Wikipedia accurate? It's not a product, it's a process. And the good experienced user of Wikipedia learns to look under the hood, see the state of the entry. It's often flags whether it's done or in process. It flags if some of the information is disputed or not. The process tells us how to read critically Wikipedia. So schools should be teaching that as a way into the research process, not shutting it out. And participation is the larger question. How do I participate in communities like Second Life, like the Sims Online, like these virtual worlds? What's good citizenship in a virtual environment? And how invested should we be in those communities? A couple of years ago, I was down in Chile, and I met this guy, Senator Fernando Flores Labra, who, as you can see, looks like archetypical Latin American political figure, not unlike a political figure in this country, but he was absolutely passionate about World of Warcraft. That's all he wanted to talk to me about when I met with this guy. You know, and he belongs to a guild, and he's involved in blind. And his pitch was that this is a place where young people are learning leadership skills with people who are distributed across the planet and who they may never meet face to face, but they're going to have to work with. And that it's a really valuable activity for creating that, and it has particular implications for those parts of the world that have historically been on the periphery, who were not part of the dominant conversations of the West, but who are seeking ways to engage from a distance. And he thinks that the next generation of leaders in Latin America will grow up playing World of Warcraft and be engaged in politics through that channel. It's a very interesting perspective. Now, when I talk about bringing games to school, which is something I've done a lot of thinking about, using games as an educational resource, people often picture you just sit in the computer and play all the time. But I want to point out that probably some of the people in this room had sons and daughters who are involved in the Model UN. Right? It's a great activity. I'm a great believer in the Model UN. It's a role play activity, right? You're taking in roles, you're working through complex systems, you're trying to achieve certain goals, and it's a simulation of how the actual United Nations operated. But if your school did it well, you didn't just show up and start playing, right? You didn't just drop you in a room, here's the game, no instructions, go at it. What you did was ramp up. You went to the library, you read the UN Charter, you had lectures or discussions about how the UN was structured, you researched your country, then you played the game, then you came back ideally, and coming out of it you had class discussions, a debrief, you may have done talks to others' classes, you may have written something up out of the experience. Think about games in the classroom in the same way. This is a game we developed when I was at MIT, at least a prototype of a game called Revolution, which is Colonial Williamsburg on the eve of the American Revolution, where each kid plays a different role in the political drama that was taking place at Williamsburg. But again, we designed it so it built off stories that are actually in the Colonial Williamsburg Gazette, which is available online from the Williamsburg Foundation. And they learned the backstory, what was taking place in this town and who these people were. They played the game, and then coming out of it, they each had a different experience they could share. So it's less like reading the textbook and trying to answer the questions at the end, and more like going to a field trip to a museum and the zoo, where all of you notice something different and can contribute to the discussion. Now, Labra's idea that games may be a site of politics is already happening. We're seeing all kinds of demonstrations, campaigns, take advantage of game spaces in a variety of ways for political speech. This image down here, which is pretty indecipherable, this is a massively, and I do mean massive, multiplayer game in China where there was a political protest where people turned out and protested in-game. And obviously a lot safer than standing in Tiananmen Square. But it will allow them to register their speech effectively in a virtual environment. So we're seeing that games, for example, are sites of learning and sites of political activism that I think are allowing new forms of expression. All right, another cliche we're getting about young people is they don't read newspapers, they're not paying attention to the world, that more of them get news from Colbert and The Daily Show than get news from NBC or CNN or Fox or the New York Times. And that's probably true. Yet I think it's based on a notion of citizenship that is monitorial. That is, you're surveying your environment and you're pointed toward issues that are vitally important to you, and those become provocations for discussion, for conversation. Those become bits that circulate outside of the show and spark dialogue of people around the cafeteria and so forth. And also, not coincidentally, they do a couple of things the news media doesn't do very well. One is digging through the archives and coming in with old footage to create a context for understanding contemporary statements. And the second is that there's more diversity of ideas represented in the guests of these shows than Nightline, right? The studies are sort of looked at what's the political spectrum represented on those shows versus traditional news shows. And it turns out that there's a lot of thinking, libertarian thinking, socialist thinking, neither of which would be available on your traditional news show, new perspectives that don't fit easily within political labels. More academics appear on The Daily Show and Colbert than appear generally on traditional news sources. So it's probably true, the cliche, that they're getting their news from The Daily Show, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. But the question is, how do they build the skills around it? How do they build the capacities around that to connect that to other resources, which help them understand the issues presented in a comic way at a more serious and deep level? So the work one of the projects we're doing right now at Annenberg, we've launched a group with MacArthur and the Spencer Foundation that are looking at young people and civic engagement. And we're looking at organizations that have been particularly effective at getting young people involved in politics and often building on the kind of participatory culture roots that I've just described. So one of them is this group, the Harry Potter Alliance. Right? This is a group that has attracted 100,000 young people around the world to be involved in human rights activism. This group has raised now 5 cargo planes from supplies for Haiti. It's been deeply involved with discussions about genocide in Darfur with key human rights organizations. It's been involved in concern for prisoners and labor and a variety of other issues that are of interest to the world at the present time. And it does it by mobilizing Harry Potter, right? It's cliche as Harry Potter taught a generation to read. Bet most of your sons and daughters read those books at some point growing up. It also, I would argue, taught a generation to write through that fan fiction site that I pointed to and through other things. Now it's teaching them how to vote and how to be involved in citizenship. And the point that the head of the organization makes is that if you think about the story, it's one where there's a deep evil in the society, where the government is complicit, where the news media is covering it up, where the school is repressing student voices, and young people on their own formed Dumbledore's army and went out and changed the world. And the challenge Andrew Slack offers to his membership is, if you had a Dumbledore's army for the real world, what would it do? What evil would it chattel, and how would it change the world? And if that's the case, what's stopping you? And so it's created a very decentralized group that works with young people in local communities. Each community is free to identify the topic they want to work on. They can work together. They can work collectively. They run house competitions. So the Slytherins, the Gryffindors, the Ravenclaw, and the Hufflepuff battle to see who can get voters to the polls to vote on local referendums that the group has identified as vitally important. It's really using the structure of fandom to get kids involved in politics. Here's another one that's sort of been interesting. There was a television series, The Last Airbender, that's on Nickelodeon. Lots of young people loved the show, and one of the things they loved about it was it had a mixed-race cast. It brought multiple cultures together. When Hollywood decided to make a film based on it, it cast all white actors in the lead parts. And the fans organized effectively to try to protest this. Their goal was to change the casting. It didn't happen. Their goal was then to sort of damage the box office. Arguably happened, but it's hard, who could tell, right? But what they did succeed to do was shape the media discussion around the film, so that every time the film producer spoke about the film, he was asked questions about their protest. And this is a protest done through Facebook, YouTube, mostly by young people trying to call attention to the representation of race in America. Once that controversy is over, a new film tried to cast an Asian part as white. They were focused on the casting call. They called it out in their media, and the studio capitulated instantly. The studios no longer are beginning to recognize that there's a public awareness of this race casting that's part of the issue. So it's another kind of example where kids are moving from participatory culture spaces of gameplay, of fan culture, and moving into the political sphere. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to this generation of young people who participate in something like the Race Bender campaign or the Ain't White campaign as they become older. Do they move from that to other issues? It seems that in both of the cases of Harry Potter and this campaign, the kids we talked to said that they were not political before, that the fandom drew them to politics. And that's significant because a lot of the research on civic engagement tells us that after a certain age, we tend to have our political engagement fixed. That if you get it through your high school years and you're not connected to politics, you're far less likely to become politically involved in college or later. So if these are getting kids in high school and college politically engaged who weren't political before, that has real implications for our literature on civic engagement. So where are we at now? The projects I'm talking about have been doing both field research and curricular design experiments. We prototype things. We're doing teacher training. And now we're going to be working here in LA with the RFK School, helping to shape media education policies, media training programs for teachers, community, and students in the school in LA. And it's going to be our laboratory, our testing space, to work with the community and try to see what the implications of this for education. So I'm going to open up for questions in just a sec, but I wanted to call attention to the fact that right after this talk, there are a variety of presentations by labs here at Annenberg. Our group is going to be presenting in room 207, and my team's going to be there. I'll be happy to talk to you. They've got some activities planned that I think are going to be interesting based on the work that we're doing. But if you go to the second floor patio, you'll have a chance to get a map of all of the demonstrations of Annenberg projects which are taking place today. So that said, I've left us about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. They're asking because they're recording this, that you go make your way to one of the mics on either side. And yes?
Yeah, I would just like to, if I may, my name is Ernest Wilson. I'm Dean of the Annenberg School. And I want to welcome all of you today. And I want to thank Henry Jenkins for that fabulous presentation. Many of us, in fact, all of our faculty here at the Annenberg School. And the themes that we try to address, there are three I's that we talk about. One is innovation. And I think you see in Henry's presentation, it's just extremely innovative across a bunch of different levels. And a lot of our faculty, all of our faculty. Second is international. And you saw that the work that Henry is doing stretches from our local neighborhoods to nationally to internationally, all over the world. And the third is impact. And we think that those three I's are essential. And we're taking very seriously has helped us and participated in redesigning our curriculum for your kids. Because we think every one of our graduates has to think about impact, has to think about entrepreneurialism in a variety of different ways. So on behalf of all of the faculty here at the Annenberg School, I do want to thank you very, very much for coming to this presentation. And as Professor Jenkins said, we look forward to seeing you upstairs so you can come and participate in our participatory culture. Thanks again.
Thank you. I have to say, one of the reasons I moved last year from MIT to USC is the quality leadership that's represented by Ernie Wilson and Geneva Overholster there, and now Larry Gross, who really are taking this school in exciting directions. And I'm really proud to be part of the team that's going forward to the future. So let's get some questions in here.
Thank you. The state of digital media today is probably, for most of us in this room, well beyond what we could have imagined 10 years ago. So given your position and what you're doing with your colleagues, what do you envision 10 years from now in 2020?
One of the things I discovered is I don't have a crystal ball. I did a book exactly 5 years ago on participatory culture called Convergence Culture, where old and new media meet. And YouTube scarcely appears in the book. The social network sites like Facebook and MySpace were just emerging. Second Life has come and gone in the time, more or less, in the time between when the book came out and the present. Twitter certainly was not conceived of at the time that I published that book. Even the term Web 2.0 wasn't on my horizons until as the book was about to go into print. So that just tells you the last 4 or 5 years of change, stuff that we now probably take as given in our environment. So could I have predicted any of that? If I could, I would have been in the book, right? So to ask if I can predict this 5, 10 years out, no, I can't. But what the book predicted were a couple of big trends. One is that media are going to be, the media environment becomes more complex, not simpler, which is to say there's not going to be a unified device that all media flows through, that it's going to be part of a larger system by which media flows between devices and devices, that the culture will be, as I've described here, more participatory, but the terms of participation are going to be constant battlegrounds, whether it's Facebook policy, privacy policies, or copyright policies. There are going to be ongoing struggles about how we participate, how much we participate, how we reshape things. But the trend toward more and more power in the hands of consumers is a very real trend that we're going to be dealing with. And that's going to be a global movement. We're going to be connecting more and more with people around the planet, but that development's uneven. In some parts of the world, we're well behind. Japan, Scandinavia, way out ahead of us in terms of its use of technology. Other parts of the world are not where we are in terms of their access and freedom of use and so forth. So we can't be lording over other groups, but we have to recognize we're all moving forward, but on unequal terms and uneven ways, and that we're going to connect with each other in very complex means. Now, and that means that any new technology that's introduced and succeeds respects those key trends of the culture. And I would argue that all the technologies I described that came out after the book came out match those principles, even if I couldn't particularly have predicted the platform or the tool or the form of social practices around it. So if I predict the future, it's only in very broad terms, not very specific ones. Yes?
Hi, Professor. Not surprisingly, I'm a parent, a citizen, and a businessman. And we were having a discussion the other day, a group of us, because we'd just been on I don't know where we were, but we'd watched the movie, not the book, of 1984. Mm-hmm. And the closing scene was really frightening because it was a bunch of women sitting around with a screen in the background, and it was basically watching them. So my question for you, in that it was written in the late 40s, is how do you correlate or contrast what we're seeing now and all the positive hype versus a guy who'd never seen it but did a pretty good job of looking into the future, at least relative to how it might go down? Well,
I think 1984 is really fascinating to reread now because it definitely describes a surveillance culture which grew from the time that he wrote that book in 1948 to the present time. But it's also assumed surveillance is one-directional, that is, Big Brother is watching us. And increasingly around the world, we're seeing that citizens are using this technology to watch Big Brother. We're calling out political leaders. We're revealing torture. We're calling attention to the lies and deceptions of government. And so that's the force that Orwell left out of the book, was the sense of citizen power. So I wouldn't deny that in many ways he predicts aspects of the culture we live in now. We have far less privacy than ever before, and far less assumption of privacy than ever before. That the number of cameras around us every day that are now invisible to us but absorb and record our behavior and are there to be retraced through, as we see in countless TV detective shows, when something bad happens, is a very real phenomenon. It's not paranoid to imagine we live in a world where much of what we do is being watched. But we also live in a world where we have communication capacities unimagined by the time that 1984 was written, that we're using to put pressure back on our government. And so I'm very interested in a group called Witness that grew out of the Rodney King video. It's a worldwide human rights watch group that tries to put cameras in the hands of everyday citizens and brings those abuses to people's attention through platforms like YouTube. And they've done some really compelling things around video that have brought things to attention. The interesting thing is much of the pictures that they end up having the most power are pictures people produced thinking they were doing good things. So Abu Ghraib photographs are a great example where the people who took those pictures didn't think they were shocking, but when they went public, they were shocking. In many countries of the world, torture is recorded on video and cell phone photography now, and when that stuff goes public, it doesn't look the way it looked to the torturer, it looks the way it looked to the victim. And that's changing the way people think about things. So yes, it's a surveillance culture, and I'm deeply concerned with it, but we also have to recognize that the public is now surveying the powerful, and that's not an option that's available to George Orwell in the time he wrote that book. So anyway, I don't know if I fully answered your question, a big one, but
thanks.
Great. So person over there? And
yeah, I have one. When you talk about the participatory culture, what do you portend it means for higher education in the years ahead? And I'm thinking in particularly, we're all here at a great university, lucky to be here, the costs are rising. The delivery platform, and how does that interact with your future of how we learn, especially at higher education? When I think about the cost of healthcare, what we have to do in this country to dampen down things like that, and maybe a little futuristic look into that crystal ball would be interesting.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is we're learning all the time as people living in this world. That learning is not contained to 4 years of college education or 5 years of high school education. That the learning is taking place outside of the classroom. And more we're seeing the Open University make materials that take place here available to people everywhere. So I gather they're taping this, and therefore it's going to presumably be out on the web. And that means other people will be able to engage in this discussion who couldn't come to USC and couldn't be part of it. And that becomes an occasion for learning. And I think its question is, how do we build activities around that? How do we support learning beyond that? How do we do large-scale online learning? And I think that's what we're beginning to experiment with. Right now, distance learning is mostly one central hub radiating information to a bunch of satellites. It's a broadcast paradigm. I'm much more interested in connecting groups together across distances. The TEDx conference series, for example, where people gather, play videos, make videos, that it becomes something that's shareable within the community, is a powerful example of participatory learning for adults in this environment. And I'd love to see our colleges connect to those kinds of systems more. And I'm worried that universities keep talking about, let's build something like YouTube. And I don't think universities need something like YouTube. They need to use YouTube. They need to be part of the larger conversation. And when we talk about building something like YouTube for the university, we're isolating the university from those larger conversations, and we're bracketing things off in curriculum and disciplines and so forth, rather than allowing the free-floating video, the spread of video that's taking place already, to carry higher educational philosophies. And then if we could add that to virtual communities and other sort of experimental sites of learning. So something like Second Life has largely been a failed experiment, and people said that Second Life, the problem with Second Life is its churn rate. That is, so many people visit it and they don't stay there. Well, I say look at the churn rate for Disneyland by those criteria, right? Most of you visited, very few of you stayed there. But what people were visiting Second Life to do was to learn, to hold meetings, to have occasional events. And if we had a business model that supported that kind of group learning, then things like Second Life could be a powerful part of the learning ecology that I'm trying to describe here. All right, was someone over there?
Actually, you have answered some of the questions I have for you, because it's more pertaining to how the IT as well as the content development have affected teaching? Because since we are here to talk about the communication, journalism, and education, IT and obviously the content development has rapidly changed and challenged journalism as well as communications way in terms of space and speed. I hear that the school may be introducing iPad as one of the teaching tools, but we also have smartphones that could deliver news. How do you think all that will be embedded or weaved into the curriculum here at the Annenberg so that these children can be more ready for the online generation?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the visionary leadership of the school is trying to invent the future of our professions. And we're trying to do it by integrating all of that stuff into our classrooms. Our student journalists here are learning how to make all those kinds of media, how to use social networks and Twitter, how to create online news, how to use video sharing, how to use podcasting. There's a lot of interest in the use of iPads for content creation and content critique, and as well as mobile phones. And there's some amazing experiments in Annenberg with kids designing tools for mobile phones and partnerships between engineering students and Annenberg students to think about it. In fact, if you go to the presentations next, you'll see a lot of examples of that are already going on in the school here. So we're all part of a larger conversation to think this through, and we eat our own dog food, as they say. We're trying to live here and try to apply in our teaching the sorts of techniques that we're discussing. So one last question, and I'll let people go.
There was a very interesting article in the Daily Trojan last week that dealt with issues of copyright and fair use. And it was a student talking about how USC has very strict anti-torrent rules in the dorms as far as downloading images, and yet in the classroom there was an assignment that was a sort of transformative, dealing with particularly Abu Dhabi image and also Shepard Fairey, who's already dealt with copyright and legal issues. And I'm wondering how, as journalism and media faculty, you will help students reconcile what may be somewhat obsolete copyright law, you know, or in the academic setting. Are there different rules than there are in the dorm when you're doing it for pleasure? And where do you, aren't those lines blurred, and how do you?
Well, I mean, we could go into a long discussion of copyright. I mean, what you're describing in the classroom would be, sounds like examples of transformative use, which would fall then under fair use protection. Straight out downloading a TV show that I missed on BitTorrent in my dorm room is not transformative. I'm simply consuming material that I should be paying for without paying for it, although that's a bigger, complex question. I think in general, piracy is as much about market failure as moral failure, and we should look at that. But I think in the classroom, it's not just, the educational purpose is part of fair use doctrine, so that we know that the use for educational purposes has some kinds of exemptions, but there's growing amount of research into how fair use might apply to remix. And so if I'd to learn that better, I'd look at the American University's Center for Social Media, which has produced a whole bunch of important guidelines, including those for classroom use and those for DIY remix use, to understand what is and isn't legitimate transformation in the classroom. Reality, it's a legal struggle, and we and the teachers have to make decisions about where we're going to go that are both ethical and legal questions. But the more we can, what I try to do is teach the debate, make the controversy itself transparent in the classroom. As I use media material, be clear to my students about why I'm using it and how I'm using it, where I'm in gray zones, when I'm in something that's firm, make sure they understand in relation to their projects. And we have to talk about both copyright and fair use, and let me add public domain as part of a conversation about how we sort through intellectual property in school and out of school. And these are issues, as I said, one of the big political battlegrounds of the future is going to be the terms of participation. And this is one of the largest battles that are part of that. So that said, my time is up. I'm happy to grab questions from others, and I will be joining my team shortly up in the room where you can see our lab.